What do Spider-Man No Way Home, Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, and 2018's God of War all have in common? The answer is magic, obviously, seeing as you've read the title, but there's a specific aspect of magic that these three examples pull off exceptionally well. It is a quality that is almost never talked about, yet I firmly believe it is the single most compelling way to use magic in a story. It has nothing to do with power escalation or whether the system's hard or soft, the things that come up all the time when writers talk about magic. It's instead, well, we'll get there in a moment. But today, I'm not just defending fantasy, I'm breaking down how fantasy has an incredible edge over every other genre. And what is this edge? Well, Spider-Man No Way Home knocks this out of the park. If you haven't seen it, the movie starts with Spider-Man's identity being made public. He hates the consequences of that, so he sees Doctor Strange for help, who then casts a spell to make sure that everyone in the world forgets Peter Parker is Spider-Man. Things are going well, that is until Peter also throws in a ton of alterations in the middle of the spell's casting, wanting to pick and choose exactly who forgets his identity. This corrupts the spell, so much so it doesn't just not work, it also tears the fabric of reality apart. Things from here just get worse and worse until in the very end, Spider-Man resolves the plot, not by blowing up the bad guy, not by spraying some blue gunk into the sky. Rather, he makes the decision for Doctor Strange to cast a new spell, one that solves the crisis, but has an effect so much worse than the original one was ever meant to have. Now, the world isn't just forgetting Peter Parker is Spider-Man, it's forgetting that Peter Parker exists entirely, including his best friends, and when he sees them after they've forgotten him in the end, choosing to not introduce himself, it makes for what I'd argue is the most cathartic and powerful ending we've ever seen in any Spider-Man movie. But why is this such a powerful ending? Like, why? Like, what does it do to work so bloody well? It's how the magic Doctor Strange uses in this movie, it's more than a mere plot device. It's a symbolic representation of taking accountability. Peter pestering Doctor Strange with alterations and exceptions in the beginning works great as a story beat because it's resonating with a universal truth that when one tries to take accountability for a terrible thing, but one picks and chooses the terms, effectively trying to take accountability just without any of the negative consequences that comes with it, that is not truly taking accountability, thus to do so can only end in disaster. And just for a second, imagine an alternate No Way Home where Doctor Strange had cast a spell in the climax, solved everything, meaning only Peter's loved ones remember he's Spider-Man, and everything's coming up Milhouse for Peter. Like, just imagine if the movie had ended in that happily ever after way. It just would have felt so wrong. It just would have. The idea that Peter massively messed up and he can just wish that away with zero consequences, like, it doesn't resonate. In fact, it does the opposite. I think something fundamental inside of us, like buried deep in our unconscious, would have disliked that ending intensely. What a lot of people learn as they go from being teenagers to being adults is to admit fault has terrible consequences. Yet, you should never run from that, because those very consequences will only compound every time you fail to deal with them. And eventually, those consequences will have built up to such a formidable mass that you have no choice but to grapple with them. And when you do, you will regret not being accountable and responsible right from the word go. This lesson most people learn as they mature, it is exactly this lesson that Peter learns in this movie, the arc he undergoes, and it reinforces the feeling that in the end, Peter's finally become an adult. And interestingly, this is a lesson that is only made more powerful because this movie uses magic. I will circle back and complete this train of thought in a second, but in order to go deeper here and properly explore this topic, have any of you heard the myth of King Midas? As the Greek legend goes, King Midas was a king who lived in decadence, who stuffed himself silly with food and had an obsession with material wealth. But no matter how many jewels he owned, it was never enough. Midas then found the follower of a god in his garden, was very hospitable to him, and in return the god offered him a wish for whatever he wanted as a thank you for taking good care of his minion. Midas then wished that everything he touches turns to gold, and from here I imagine most of you know the rest. He was initially overjoyed by his new powers, running around his palace touching everything he could, but after his initial fun he tried to eat some food, but couldn't, because it turned to gold the moment it touched his lips. He tried to sleep, but couldn't. His soft bed turned to metal beneath him. Crying in despair, his beloved daughter came to see what was the matter, and when he held her, she turned to gold too. And now, the way the myth ends varies. Some tellings have him remain this way forever and dying of starvation, but the main telling involves him voicing true repentance for his wish, and the god then turns things back to how they used to be. But can you see the similarities between this myth and Spider-Man No Way Home? Because there are a lot of them. And the fact these great stories are so similar highlights a crucial insight as to what makes for great storytelling. Midas wished that everything he touched turned to gold. This was a terrible mistake, and it's a mistake fueled by an incorrect belief the character had. The belief that the path to true happiness lies in material gain. And it is this exact belief that leads to him losing the taste of food, of the comfort of a good night's sleep, and depriving himself of his relationship with his daughter. Yes, this is a myth, but perhaps it's made a myth because it has the same qualities as a parable. A parable being a story that effectively teaches a lesson by conveying a universal truth, an archetypal truth. And which one is that? It isn't that you should be careful what you wish for, it's instead what happened to King Midas is what will happen to you if you get too obsessed with material wealth, as you will gradually lose the other things in life that matter, until material wealth is the only thing you have left. And what a hollow, sad life that must be. Spider-Man wished for everyone but those he cared about to forget him. It is him cherry-picking the terms of the spell that is the manifestation of the lie Peter believes, in the same way it was for King Midas. If Spider-Man had been wiser, he would have accepted the dire consequences of the initial spell with grace. If King Midas had been wiser, he would have wished for the ability to better serve his people, or that his beloved daughter might live a long, healthy life. Or perhaps, if he had been exceptionally wise, he would have never wished for anything at all. And there is something important to learn here, as it betrays why some stories are remembered and others forgotten. Because when I name drop King Midas, I'd bet that the majority of you had no bloody clue who the man was. His name didn't ring a bell for you. However, when I said that everything he touched turned to gold, I'm willing to bet money that 100% of you, literally every single person watching this video, was like, oh yeah, I remember that story, the one where all he touches turns to gold. I've heard that one before. The question is, why? Why is it that every single one of us remembers the premise of that myth? A myth where the last time you heard it, that might have been over a decade ago. Meanwhile, if I were to ask you the basic premise of that crappy movie you saw on Netflix 10 months ago, you wouldn't be able to recall a thing. That is an extremely interesting question. I cannot stress how excited this question gets me, because it's such the importance of this question, it can't be understated from a storytelling point of view. And here's what I reckon's the answer. The quality of a story is not just defined by how exciting the plot is, or how entertaining the characters are, it's also defined by the truths explored within that story. And it's when a story does an outstanding job at exploring a truth, whichever one that might be, at giving the audience food for thought and helping them be just that little bit wiser. That is when that story is taken to a whole other level of quality and thus popularity. Personally, I've noticed that when I think a story is about to say something insightful, that is when any story is its most captivating for me. And I imagine a lot of you feel the same way too. Deep down, we all don't just yearn for entertaining stories, we also yearn for ones with deep meaning. And the fact almost all myths do this, how they've endured in our minds for decades, as well as in our culture for thousands of years, because they're such excellent parables. That isn't exactly news, right? That's not exactly a controversial take. But what's the question that I feel has been totally neglected here? Why are all myths technically fantasy. This plays directly into the question of this video, in how to do magic right, and it's a question that's been staring us all in the face for all our lives, but we pretty much never ask it. Why is it that every myth has magic? From Arthurian legend, to Norse mythology, to Greek mythology, how they involve cursed women with snake heads that turn people to stone, and enchanted swords that only the true king can wield, and gods punishing the petulant for the flaws in their character. I believe the answer is a simple one, that magic in storytelling is the ultimate device to use if you want your story to say something meaningful, and it's so exceptional at this that all of mythology makes use of it, as any potential myths that didn't use it were based purely in reality. That was a story that didn't distill truths well enough to have been remembered, and was thus a story lost to time. There are so many things you need to think about if you want to build a great magic system. The rules need to make sense, there needs to be interesting limitations, and far more challengingly, it must capture people's imaginations. And frankly, I've never experienced a story that knocks all of those things out of the park better than Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn saga. Like seriously, if you want to write better magic, I think The Final Empire and all of the subsequent Mistborn books are just required reading material, because they're the gold standard of how to do magic right. And if you're interested, I've got a great deal for you, as thanks to Audible, the sponsor of today's video, you can grab the audiobook for The Final Empire, the first Mistborn novel today, totally for free. Audible really is the best place on the internet to grab your audiobooks, and what I love so much about Audible is how it allows me to read all the things I want to read without making any sacrifices as I listen while playing games, cooking dinner, commuting around, and doing all the daily things I was going to do anyway. And today, thanks to Audible, so can you. If you click my link in the description or text closer look to 500, you'll get a free credit used to get any audiobook you like, and I cannot recommend The Final Empire enough to you. Like, I devoured the first 3 Mistborn audiobooks in the space of like 10 days because I loved them so much, and I implore that you will lose your social lives and go to bed 3 hours late every day for the next 10 days too. Again, do click my link in the description or text closer look to 500 and get lost in the incredible Mistborn saga today. But back to it, in order to realise the exact mechanics of how magic distills truth, how it's the ultimate way to add meaning to a story, let's look at a story that pulls this off exceptionally well. Let's look at Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. If you want to realise the truth this movie explores, what the story is about essentially, all you have to do is look at the monster, the basilisk, bear that in mind, and then ask, what are the 3 main fear responses any animal has when confronted by a predator? There's fight, flight, and what? Freeze. And in the Chamber of Secrets, what happens when someone sees the basilisk? They get petrified. They literally freeze. The basilisk in this story is not just the antagonist, it's a symbolic embodiment of fear itself. The more you think about this, the more sense it makes, because as the story goes along, everyone in the castle is being increasingly terrified by the snake. That is until our hero Harry descends into the depths to confront the monster in its home. And once doing so, what immediately happens? Fawkes, the phoenix, uses its claws to gouge out the basilisk's eyes, and this means Harry will no longer be petrified if he sees the beast. And here's a really interesting thing. When I describe it in this way, it really does sound like a plot convenience. It really does. Like the big monster suddenly losing its main power totally out of the blue? That should feel incredibly unsatisfying. But it doesn't. In fact, I've never heard anyone ever criticize this moment in the story, despite its seeming total contrivance. And this moment works because it's tapping into our collective unconscious that defines whether or not things such as this feel right to us. While everyone in the story has been cowering in fear of fear itself, Harry has bravely chosen to directly confront it, and in doing so, as a consequence of his brave decision, the symbol of fear has suddenly lost its capacity to petrify. This is commenting on the truth that being brave and directly confronting fear head-on, in simply making that decision, you weaken the effect fear has over you. In a sense, directly confronting fear is not just a highly effective way to overcome it, it is the only way to do so. And the truths explored don't stop there, because later in the climax, when he confronts the snake, he stabs it but is sadly bitten at the same time. He's poisoned and is doomed to die. But just before he does, Fawkes again comes around, cries into his wound, and cures him. God, this is even more of a Deus Ex Machina than that last one. And it didn't bother anybody. Like, why does this Deus Ex Machina work so well as a story beat? It's because the phoenix is a symbol for rebirth, as the animal endlessly grows old, dies and is reborn from the ashes, and when the symbol for rebirth heals the wounds Harry sustained in his final battle with fear, it's capturing the truth that when people directly confront their demons, they will get hurt, just as a fact. However, once they've beaten their demons, their terrible wounds will heal, and the person will have a metaphorical rebirth from the ashes of their old self, as they become a better person because of their struggle. The same can be said for how throughout the book, the paranoia and nervousness of everyone in the castle has been growing increasingly worse as the story progresses, and sure, this sense of increasing tension and dread does a lovely job at adding to the rising action, but yet again, it's resonating with the truth that we all know, we just don't consciously know. The truth that when something comes along that induces fear, not solving the issue will only cause that fear to grow worse and more terrible, and worse and more terrible until it feels like a poison in our veins. And the worst possible moment, the true dark night of the soul, will always, inevitably be the moment just before the fear is confronted. But once it is, then comes the relief as the fear washes away and the catharsis comes. What I just described is not a plot structure. Instead, it's what it feels like in real life when we confront the things we're afraid of. Like, the idea of someone using universal truths like this in their climax, it's fantastic already. But to wrap one's sense of rising action around an archetypal truth like this as everyone grows increasingly more terrified, because that's what happens to all of us when we procrastinate on dealing with the things we're afraid of, the story elements harmonize together. And this is, and I'm just gonna say it, incredible storytelling. The word outstanding is simply inadequate. This is a true masterpiece. The narrative choices made here are simply inspired and has this real, mythological quality to it. If you're a writer, the ceiling of who you should aspire to be is the kind of creator who makes narrative choices as wholeheartedly genius as these. What's quite interesting here is how there's a very real chance that Rowling didn't consciously realise these things. Perhaps she did, but there's a very good chance that she wrote her story, simply did what felt right to her, and incidentally, what felt right to her was tapping into these universal truths. This opens up a whole Pandora's box of a conversation around the collective unconscious, a very brief summary of which being how there's supposedly an incredible amount of wisdom that you and I don't consciously know, but rather unconsciously do, as we've inherited it from both the human genome, as these base ideas and constructs will inevitably form in every human mind regardless of nurture, and also from the stories, the myths, the lessons we learn as we live our lives. It is this hidden trove of wisdom we all have deep in the recesses of our minds that is what defines whether or not certain story beats, despite being unforeshadowed and coming from seemingly out of nowhere, such as Fawkes blinding the basilisk, feel so very right nonetheless. And if you want another example from recent media of this approach done exceptionally well, 2018's God of War pulls this off wonderfully. It is a game with a near universally loved story, and that is a bloody impressive thing to pull off in this day and age. And if you ask me, the fact the game resonates with these truths exactly in the same way Spider-Man did, exactly in the same way myths do, that greatly contributed towards the game's near universal acclaim. In this game, Kratos is a god with a dark past. He has killed the entire Greek pantheon, more or less, and has done some rather depraved things in his time, and so he actively hides from his past. He doesn't tell his son of their true heritage, making his son believe he's just a normal human, not the god he is. Throughout the game, people warn Kratos that his son must know.
The longer you wait to tell him his true nature, the more damage you do. He will resent you, and you may lose him forever.
There is much about me I would not have him know.
It's unhealthy to hide these things, they say, but Kratos totally ignores them. That is until the son accidentally taps into his latent powers and it makes him severely ill, rendering him at death's door. Kratos is then told by a witch that in order to save his son, he has to delve into hell. Quite literally delve into the underworld, which fits the hero's journey really rather snugly. And he has to fetch a magical MacGuffin to revive him. To do this, the axe he's used so far in the story is going to be useless. In order to visit the underworld and cure his son's sickness, he has to pick up the Blades of Chaos, the weapons from his dark past, the ones he's kept hidden beneath the floorboards in their home all this time. He then uses these blades to complete his quest, revive his son, and quickly after he does so, he tells his son that his father is a god, and therefore he is too. Before this point in the story, the son has been endlessly coughing and showing signs of sickness. After this point, he no longer shows any symptoms of any sickness at all. This, exactly like the myth of King Midas, is capturing a truth, and it's that to hide from one's past, to mask one's heritage, no matter how dark, is always a bad thing. The son's magical sickness is a symbol for what happens when someone doesn't know their true heritage. To not know where one hails from is a form of sickness. And the Blades of Chaos represent shame. They represent regret, but mostly they represent the evils, the demons of Kratos' past. There is a lot of symbolism going on here. Even better, there are multiple symbols interacting with each other. When Kratos picks up his blades in order to visit the underworld, this represents his decision to hide from his past no longer. And it is Kratos doing this that is what facilitates his son regaining his health. And why does this magic work so well? Like, why is it that all of mythology is technically fantasy? It is not because such stories are better at capturing the imagination. It is not because the people of the past were superstitious and thus had a preference for those kinds of stories, at least not mainly that, but because fantasy is the ultimate genre for distilling truth, as fantasy allows one to go larger than life, with cyclopses and maniacal dark lords, and magic spells that erase the memory of someone from everyone's mind. It's in going larger than life that renders these elements detached from reality enough that you can mold them into perfect symbolic representations of ideas from our reality. And in doing so, that allows you to provide commentary on those ideas with so much more precision than you could ever manage in a purely contemporary story where every aspect is grounded in reality and thus muddied by it. And when you have an element in your story be a symbol for an idea, that means every time your character interacts with this element, whether it be when they get close to the One Ring from Lord of the Rings, or any time someone tries to wield Excalibur from Arthurian legend, or any time someone dares to open Pandora's box, that's an opportunity for you to provide laser-focused, insightful commentary on the idea this fantastical object is a symbol of. In an odd sort of way, the fact fantasy can allow itself to be so detached from reality allows it to scrutinize our reality with a level of exactness that a non-fantasy writer would envy, as that is a luxury that is seldom granted to you when writing in any genre that is not fantasy. As a fun tip, if you really want to knock this out of the park, having one symbol can work great, but having two such symbols interacting with each other works even better, because now you can explore the relationship between the ideas these two things represent. God of War pulled exactly that off with flying colours. This is the hidden quality magic has in storytelling, the one that I wish was so much more prevalent in discourse around the topic, because if you ask me, nailing the way magic complements your theme is so much more important a thing to get right than having a perfectly done power escalation could ever be. And again, if you really like the sound of Mistborn, one of my favourite novel series of all time, you can listen to it right now for free on Audible by clicking my link in the description or texting close look to 500 500. I hope you enjoy Mistborn as much as I did, because when you find the right story and it just captures you like the Final Empire did for me, nothing compares to it. But anyway, hope you like the video, keep writing, and I'll see you guys next time on The Closer Look.